Okay, welcome everybody. Second to last colloquium of this semester. I'm really pleased to welcome Maxine McKinney de Royston, who many of you probably know. She graduated from UC Berkeley with her PhD in education and a certificate in the Research and Cognition in Mathematics Education program. And her work focuses on issues of race, identity, and learning, predominantly in Black school settings and in mathematics classrooms. She's published her work in the Journal of the Learning Sciences, in the Journal for Research in Mathematics Education, and in the Harvard Educational Review. And right now, Maxine is a National Academy of Education Spencer Postdoctoral Fellow here in the Graduate School of Education, and she'll be presenting some of her most recent work. So, welcome, Maxine.
All right, so you guys are going to have to bear with me. Of course, I woke up with a frog in my throat, so I have some coffee to try to get us through. And Camilla set us up nicely, but also maybe gave a little bit of what she thought was correct information, but which I've changed, which is I'm not going to talk mostly about my current stuff. I'm actually going to talk about sort of the arc of my work. So, as she mentioned, I was here as a graduate student. I'm now here as a postdoc. And in that time, I've done a lot of interesting things. And I was sort of influenced by a talk last week by Danny Martin, who was also a graduate student here and has had sort of an illustrative career, in which he sort of did a retrospective of his work since his time as a graduate student. And I thought, oh well, hey, since I'm going to be leaving here too very soon, maybe I'll do a similar thing and think about the work that I've done. And in going on job talks recently, it's really been an opportunity to reflect on the work that I've done and think about how I frame that work. And I think, especially for junior scholars, that sometimes we focus a lot on sort of outcomes, like who got a fellowship, who filed, who did that, and we focus less on the process, the journey of how we got to come to form the ideas that we have and research the ideas that we're interested in. And so this is my attempt at doing that. And so I'm calling it my little research mixtape, which is the theme across it is sort of the concepts that I've come to understand and how I've come to understand them. So my goal today, besides coffee, is to share with you how I've come to examine teaching and learning as embedded within and across multiple levels of racialized contexts. And I'm going to argue that moment-by-moment interactions in classrooms and in schools can really be micro-instantiations of broader discourses of power that have critical implications for how we think sociopolitically and not just socioculturally about the nexus between teaching and learning, particularly for African American students. So hopefully you will honor my sentimentality. And I'm first going to take you to what I thought then. So this is a little statement. This is a little piece of my excerpt from my personal statement as a graduate student. So every couple of years I look back at this thing and say, you know, what was I trying to do when I first came here? Because you get so many ideas and then you get so caught in what you're doing. So it's nice sometimes to step back and try to see the forest through the trees. So then I really was interested in what specific factors or practices provide students with a framework for understanding. And you know, go past the vagueness and the wordiness. See the ideas here, right? How does that framework affect their ability to participate and succeed in formal classroom environments? What are the sociocultural dynamics and practices that influence student motivation and performance? Then I go on to say, you know, I want to generate theories and practices for educational practice, right? I looked at it a couple days ago. I thought it wasn't that bad. And after sort of looking at these factors actually for a number of years, this is sort of my current broad research question, which isn't terribly different. How do racialized, socio-affective factors affect African American students' learning? And so if we look back at the initial one, there's sort of the beginnings there of some of these ideas, right? I didn't know necessarily how to articulate them. But what these beginnings really highlight is sort of my awareness at the time as sort of an uninformed person of an overwhelming narrative that we all sort of now know about, which is that African American students' outcomes are poor, right? Something's going on. And that these questions, even early on, reflect sort of an emerging understanding on my own part of that this outcome focus is insufficient. That it doesn't fully explain even my own limited experiences as an African American student in public schools, where I had many colleagues who were in gifted and talented, many colleagues who were in magnet programs, who were at the top of their class, and then ultimately didn't graduate, or haven't gone on to what we might term as successful careers, right? So my own experience suggests that there's something else going on other than lack of desire, lack of ability, lack of motivation, but there's something actually happening in schools potentially with certain groups of students. So moving forward, I've started to look at this in sort of a racialized way, trying to understand what I'm looking at is in terms of socio-affective factors. And by socio-affective, I really mean the interpersonal, the social, the things that are typically deemed not cognitive or not directly tied to content learning, but which I would argue are inextricably tied to content learning, and particularly tied to people's sense of belonging, sense of being able to engage in a task. And a lot of these things play out at the level of teacher-student relationships, students' identities, or students' sense of belonging. And so I'm going to argue that these socio-affective factors often are the preconditions that support students' learning, especially for those students whose personhood, whose forms of knowledge, whose communities, and other factors related to them are often positioned as at odds with school, at odds with what is expected, at odds with what is valued within schools and within classrooms. And so recognizing these socio-affective factors, that they also have a racialized tenor to them that often indexes broader socio-historical narratives and dynamics of power. So specifically, I'm intrigued by how teachers understand and respond to these factors, particularly teachers' interactions and teachers' actions in classrooms with their students, their ideas around the pedagogical practices, the ways that they develop or adapt their curriculum. And in this, trying to attend to the ways in which these kinds of actions position students racially and culturally, with respect to the discipline, their disciplinary identities, and with their identities as learners, in ways that can either support their learning or constrain their learning and their inclusion in learning opportunities. I often look at how they play out interactionally, how they play out pedagogically, and as I said, through some adaptations of the curriculum and how they focus on content. And I'm particularly interested in how this plays out in STEM classrooms, both because math classrooms in particular are really gatekeeping subjects that are high stakes for how students move forward through schools, but also because I think that there's spaces where the cognitive is presumed to really sort of dominate. Either you get math or you don't get math. Either you're a math person or you're not a math person. And sort of a lot of these socio-affective factors that influence learning are considered to be subsidiary or not included within that space of a mathematics classroom, right? They're considered to be very secondary. And you often hear teachers talk about, I don't worry about all that stuff, I just focus on the math. If I focus on the math, then my kids will learn. And I'm going to try to push on that idea just a little bit to think about how socio-affective factors really push on sort of dynamics of power in these spaces. So, I argue that these questions that I'm raising around the socio-affective factors, particularly for African American students, really require frameworks that attend to multiple levels of context. I'm going to explain each level of context a little bit later, but for now, I think it's important to understand that I'm arguing that the activities, the knowledge, and the identities are performed and positioned at micro or moment-by-moment levels of interaction, and that they're indexed in ways that really highlight macro-level socio-historic collective ideas that's sort of at the level of our collective imagination. They really narrate these identities and these practices and these ways of knowing. And I have up there multidimensional, ecological, sociopolitical frameworks, because a lot of these theories are termed in these ways, but they're really all sort of building off of ecological theories like Rothenbrenner's or sociocultural theories that are really developed to reflect the ways that multiple contexts, that individual interacts across multiple contexts, and that individuals draw from these multiple contexts and adapt these multiple contexts in different ways. And that in these contexts, there's different social practices, tools, and relations that they utilize to accomplish their learning goals. At the same time, a lot of scholars are also pushing on these sort of ecological theories with a sociopolitical focus So some of the scholars listed here, particularly Rochelle Gutierrez, Chris Gutierrez, Danny Martin, Vicki Hand, and others who've come through the halls here, they also recognize that the sociocultural or even ecological theories sometimes lack attention to how dynamics of power play out, how the sociocultural features that we talk about can reify and are reified, can reify and reify broader hierarchies of power. And in my case, I utilize multidimensional frameworks to examine how at the micro level, at the active level of sort of acts of positioning that occur between students and between teachers and students, can really differentially privilege or marginalize certain activities, certain knowledge, and certain identities in ways that mirror dominant social and institutional discourses. So I argue that these kind of multidimensional analyses, if we're attending to the level of the sociopolitical, of these analyses of power, can really allow us to look at the ways in which things are privileged or marginalized in classroom spaces, and even in smaller interactions between people. So this representation is my attempt at highlighting what I see as a multidimensional framework, and highlighting sort of the different levels of context that I'm attending to. And I'm going to try to show you how they iteratively interact and influence one another over time. So I'm going to begin by explaining sort of a top level down. And in doing that, I'm both synthesizing sort of sociocultural perspectives and units of analysis, and then also further nuancing them to attend to the dynamics of power, to this what I'm calling the sociopolitical. So, like sociocultural approaches, sociopolitical views appreciate that learning occurs through interaction and participation in cultural activities, practices, and informs ways of being. However, sociopolitical approaches explicitly recognize the hierarchical nature by which certain histories or narratives, institutions, practices, and identities are privileged over others. So if we look at the top level, at the level of society, there exists racialized dominant meanings and values, i.e. big D discourses, that pervade sort of our social imagination. And then these are transmitted through how our institutions, our schools, our families, are constructed and how they operate. And they're also reflected in the cultural practices that we use every day, how we value those cultural practices, and how we sort of use these practices in certain settings and not in other settings, how we sort of see which practices can be used across contexts and which practices are very contextual to one context. And we could also see how these practices play out at the individual level of individual persons' identities and ways of knowing. So we can see the way that the macro moves down to the micro in terms of different discourses, institutions, practices, and to the level of individuals. But that's not the only way that it works. It also maps back up, right? So we just take at the level of an individual, these identities and ways of knowing also map back up to the kinds of practices that people employ, the ways that they might employ assimilatory practices, the way that they resist certain kinds of practices and come up with new practices, and the way that those practices also shape the way institutions operate. And back up to the level of society, the ways in which racialized narratives are either reified or that they're challenged and reconstructed. So we can see in this way how sort of macro narratives about race can affect individual learning, and how it can map back up and conceptualize how the process of teaching and learning is actually dynamic, and that's both influenced by and influences these sort of multiple layers of context. So there's this sort of iterative feedback loop that my little arrows are trying to show, where we see the ways in which these levels of context play in sort of within a context, but also across context. And I would argue that this lens also presents a challenge for us to do very, very well, and I say us as researchers and us as teachers, to do well that which we're very invested in, which is to examine the complexities of learning, to examine the complexities of the human learning process, including its social, organizational, and cultural dynamics, and to examine these across different kinds of contexts. And so to do that, we're going to need to conceptualize learning as more than a set of cognitive processes, which I think we do pretty well, but also as a set of processes that happen through interaction, and that these interactions themselves have particular social, cultural, and political valences. And I argue that I need these kinds of lenses given the kinds of research fields that I am bringing together in my own work. So I bring together what I would term the learning sciences, STEM fields, and sort of this broad field of race, culture, and schooling. And at the level of the learning sciences, we're really concerned with instructional methodologies and learning environments. And really at that point, and this is an overgeneralization, people do very different work, but in general, we're concerned with sort of the micro level of classrooms, or the micro level of an interaction, or of an instructional strategy. And obviously there are notable exceptions, like Bridget Barron's work, Phil Bell's work, my own work, Carol Lee's work, Vicki Hand, and others, who really look at learning over time and space and consider things like violence and poverty, and the ways in which that informs students' identities and learning trajectories and pathways. And in the STEM field, we're concerned with how we teach and how we learn disciplinary content. And so this leads us to be very concerned with understanding individual learners, or groups of learners, and the kinds of practices, tasks, or curriculum that we employ. And obviously, again, Jeff and Naila are pushing us to consider new things, like the durability and transferability of certain practices and ideas to new contexts. The ideas of collective practices and interaction routines and how they connect with individual and community roles, expectations, and histories. And then at the level of race, culture, and schooling, there's often a concern about patterns of achievement about certain groups of students, with these students' experiences in schools and cultural practices with these groups of students being shaped by sort of social discourses. But here we're often concerned about the level of the institution, at the level of the social narratives, and we often like the ways to look really deeply at interactional things. I mean, people have started talking about like racial microaggressions, but there's not a lot of ways to actually see how those things play out in real time, and then how that maps out to particular types of narratives that are being engaged and being indexed in the moment. So that was sort of this broad framing. And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to do the fun stuff, which is get into some of the data. And this is going to be a taste of the data. I'm not going to go deep into any one study, because again, this is my research mixtape. So I'm going to show you the themes that have merged across these different data, these different studies and the different data that I've been working with and looking at over the years. So I'm first going to go through, and this also sort of maps nicely onto the chronology of the development of my own ideas. So I'm going to first go through a study of differential influence that I did with Randy Engel and Jennifer Lengo-Suna as a graduate student. And in that, I'm going to show the sort of richness of conducting micro-level analyses that attend to socio-affective aspects of learning, like positioning and how students negotiate scientific understandings and norms. And then I'm going to share my dissertation research, where I use sort of narratives and school-level analyses rather than micro or moment-by-moment analyses to consider how one school engaged racialized narratives through its racial socialization practices and its identity-affirming practices. And then finally, I'm going to go to some work that I've been doing as a postdoc with Naila Nasir in Oakland with the Manhood Development Project. And so there is where I really began to explicitly focus my analytical lens on instructors themselves and how they're making sense of multiple levels of context. So in this first one, in the first study, I'm really looking sort of these two levels. In the third, I'm looking kind of these three levels. And in this last study, I'm sort of looking across these levels with a real attention to what instructors are attending to in their practice and how that sort of shapes the learning environment. And so then I'm going to finally, and at the end of all of this, with some implications for my work and some little hints at the kind of work that I'm doing right now. So the first study of differential influence came out of a class here at Berkeley with Randy Engel around discourse and learning, which is a class I'm actually teaching right now, which is great. And what happened was Randy had to go to a conference, and she said, watch this really interesting video that I wrote a paper about, and tell me what you think is interesting, tell me what you think is surprising, and if you agree with the analysis that we did. And we didn't even talk about the paper that we actually read that day. Instead, we talked about what was really surprising about this video. And so it's a 27-minute video. I'm going to go ahead for a second. It's a 27-minute video of a student-led discussion in a 5th grade classroom, which is a fostering community of learners classroom. And in this classroom, there was really attention paid to the research perform activity cycle, where the idea was that students were researching something, that they would then have a presentation and sort of share their understandings, and then they would sort of move on to the next thing. So to go back, that was the context in which we were looking at this particular video. And what's interesting about this discussion and watching it is, even when we turned off the sound, there was so much activity happening, people were so engaged, and you just wanted to figure out what is going on here, right? And when we were and this particular piece of data is coming from a research unit they were engaged in around endangered species, and the group that we looked at were interested in looking at whales. So they had created this whole, they had done a lot of work on research on whales, and they had created this whole poster around different kinds of whales. And so at the end of this unit, they were supposed to perform something, so they decided to do this poster, and right before they went to do this poster, they went to a day at Marine World as sort of a culmination of their sort of experience of looking at whales. And during their experience at Marine World, one of the trainers had introduced something about killer whales, and he basically said that they're dolphins and not whales, which threw their whole project into disarray, because they're like, this whole thing's been around killer whales, and now they're not even whales. We've got to start all over again. So needless to say, they were upset. So what the teacher did, which was part of the standards of this class, which is that they brought them all back together into the classroom afterwards and said, okay, you guys have a conversation about this. You guys figure out, given your own understanding, your own research around whales, what is a killer dolphin? Is it an orca? I mean, what is a killer dolphin? Is it a whale or is it a dolphin? And so they did have this big old argument, as Brian alludes to. And Brian actually convinces everyone. So they all came in believing the trainers, because they saw the trainers as an authority. They all believed the trainers that killer whales are dolphins. So initially they thought they were whales, so the trainers said that they're dolphins, and so they said, okay, we agree with the trainers. Then they came to this conversation, and Brian was the only one who said, no, they're whales. I've done all this research, I know that they're whales. And by the end of it, he actually convinced everyone that they were whales. So our analysis then goes into whether or not, what happens in this situation, how he influenced everybody to come over to his side. And we also touched upon something that we thought was really interesting, which is we didn't think Brian actually had the best arguments. That he actually didn't have good evidence. And evidence was a huge norm in this classroom that people had. So we had strong evidence, either sort of documented evidence, lexical evidence, anatomical evidence. And it turns out that of all the students who contributed, the main 5 contributors, Brian had the lowest evidence, which suggested that, yes, something was going on besides just they saw there was a norm of quality to this idea, and they took it up. Which, as you can see from the picture, people are thrusting their hands, standing up. There was something else going on. So, in conducting this sociocultural analysis of the biblical argument, we actually, in doing sort of this micro-level analysis of this small interaction, we watched this videotape with sound, super slow, without sound, super slow. Like, I can literally tell you, where somebody's eye gaze goes in every moment in the video, how somebody pronounces their words, etc., because we watched this variety of times. And what we found in doing that kind of a micro-level analysis is that Brian's influence actually wasn't that surprising. Because what he did was that he really took up some socio-affective aspects of the learning environment. So first, in the beginning of the argument, the teacher framed the argument as, are orcas whales or are they dolphins? Right? So this initial framing of the question sort of gave authority to these two sides and created sort of this binary. Well, it actually turns out that that's actually not even the correct binary. Does anybody know?
Well, I'm looking at Wikipedia and it says that they are a toothed whale belonging to the oceanic dolphin family.
Exactly. So it's actually both, right? So this framing actually wouldn't allow them to come to the correct answer anyway, right? But also, in doing this framing early on in the discussion, the teacher's not there for most of the discussion, but she's there in the beginning. The teacher positioned Brian as an authority. She said, Brian's got some serious points that you need to consider before you decide this. and Bryant was the expert on the anatomical features of whales. So he was framed as an authority, and this framing was key for then how the social negotiations unfolded in the activity. And finally, in the video analyses, we're also noticing both how there was a framing of authority, but also how people were positioned with respect to the conversational floor, which is what we're calling sort of a souped-up version of turn-taking. So the ways in which some students were repeatedly called upon, others were ignored, and some were routinely interrupted when they tried to actually engage in a turn. And people did this in ways that were also spatial. So if somebody was raising their hand to take a turn and somebody pushed their hand down, or somebody stepped in front of somebody so they couldn't sort of get the gaze of the speaker. So a lot of interactional things that shaped how the conversation unfolded and ultimately what kinds of ideas were taken up and who was seen as influential. So in this doing sort of a sociocultural analysis, we saw a lot of interesting things that explained sort of this undue influence on the part of Brian, but it also couldn't explain certain kinds of other things. So for example, there were times when people said things up like, "Shut up, little girl," or "Sit down, boy," to one another that sort of really evoked sort of racial and genderized moments that we couldn't really talk about. And we couldn't talk about them because we didn't have the lens to talk about it, but we also didn't have the data to really look at how these things were instantiated over time. We had sort of one 27-minute transcript. But even in reading this transcript and analyzing it, these kinds of comments were unsettling. And we didn't really have a way to talk about it. Similarly, there were two other students. This was 10 students that participated. There are two students who actually didn't say anything over the course of the debate. And afterwards, in reflecting upon the debate, a lot of the students questioned whether or not those two students were even present. So they sort of became socially invisible in the interaction, right? And those students were there. They just didn't participate. And in fact, a few times when they tried to make inclinations to participate, they were sort of socially isolated. And these happened to be some of the students of color, an African-American female student, and a male South Pacific Islander. So we didn't really have the ways to talk about those kinds of things either. And so this is where I came into thinking about the role of sociopolitical analyses in terms of the kinds of data that we need to attend to these things, but also how we begin to analyze these issues of power in classrooms and of how things are playing out in terms of privilege and marginalization, not for just their sort of own sake at a small level, but do these things map onto sort of larger discourses of power that we see in society. And so the difference between sort of sociocultural and sociopolitical then is this focus on power rather than culture. And so I want to now go into my dissertation research where, so this is sort of the, I guess would be like, not really side B, but fading into side B of the mixtape, where I really began to attend to the sociopolitical in some ways through the data, but also sort of in my own thinking. And in this data, rather than doing sort of moment-by-moment interactional analyses, I did more narrative and school-level analyses, and that is in part because of the kinds of data that I had access to. This was a very small community, and I have a little handout so you guys can, who cannot read all those small words, can see. But this was an elementary school, 30 kids, K through 6, been around for 30 years. And being that it was such a small school, it was really hard to figure out how to do videotaping in that environment. But also, as I became more a member of the community, I realized that videotaping actually, wouldn't capture what was happening there and wasn't really appropriate for that space. So the narrative analysis, because I have to rely upon ethnographic field notes. But coming into this study, I was interested in looking more about sort of multiple levels at the level of the school, and how schools might engage racialized narratives. And to give a bit of context, this particular school was interesting to me because of some of the claims that it made. So obviously it was interesting because it was a very small school and it was actually like a one-room schoolhouse of 30 kids across grade levels. But it also made some really interesting claims like, that their mission was to create a racially just, culturally relevant, and equitable learning environment for students. And then this one, which is really the one that most intrigued me, was that more than 80% of its graduates later go on to college. And this one was across like all of its documentation, like all of its pamphlets, things that people said to one another when people were interviewing to go to the school. And I just thought it was interesting. How would an elementary school say that 80% of its graduates go on to college? Like, what do you have to do with it? Right? Like, it didn't make sense to me. And so I was kind of interested in finding out if other people, how they made sense of that. Because the teacher, not only the teacher talked about it, but parents also talked about it. So it was something salient for them. So the research questions that I started to look at there were in alignment with my overall research program, but also, how does Marshall specifically attend the socio-affective, and how is it viewed in relation to African American students' learning? And I was really wanting to focus on how do teachers, that's weird, address socio-affective dimensions of learning in their practice. So I engaged in participant observation at this school. For 2 years, I went every day, every week, for a day. And I rotated the days that I went because I had different curriculum on different days. And I can talk a little bit more about the nuances of the research design in the Q&A if people have questions about that. And I interviewed all the teachers. And I also interviewed some past teachers. Because since the school is around for 30 years, I really wanted to get a sense of if what I'm seeing now is a slice of something new, or is it a part of a larger whole? Has the school been sort of engaging in similar ways over time? And are the perceptions of it and how it operates over time similar, consistent, or different? And so in that, I also interviewed alumni and surveyed alumni as a way to get people to do interviews and to get some sense of the themes that I want to push on in interviews. I also engaged parents, both because they're the ones that choose the school and they have very particular reasons for choosing schools, but also get their perceptions about what was happening at the school. And again, I looked at parents who had been in that environment over time. So parents who came from when the school started in 1979, to parents who just put their kids in that school a year before. And I should also say, for the alumni, and the ones who responded to my survey and did interviews, that ranged from people who were 12 years old, who graduated from school a year before, to people who were 37. I don't know if you heard 37. 37 who had gone on to college, had gone on to careers, and so they really were able to reflect both in an academic but also in a professional way on the kinds of education they received at the school and compare with other educational contexts. And so again, providing a sort of slice of the kinds of things that I found, is that I found that there were sort of these socio-affective aspects of Marshall that were really salient. One was that teachers at Marshall were explicit about their belief that schools should be humanizing spaces, and they were concerned about Black students' experiences with stereotypes and interactions at other schools. So at Marshall, this concern manifested in its philosophy of holistically attending to children's multiple developmental needs: their academic needs, their emotional needs, physical and cultural needs. And so they had this whole child philosophy that really guided all of the instruction and interactions in the school. And this is demonstrated by this quote from the principal, who was also the founder of the school, when she's sort of mentoring a new teacher. So she's just observed this teacher do a lesson in one of her within her first semester of being at the school. And afterwards, at lunch, she says to her, you can work students hard. They can do that. But this is a public school. We teach without breaking students' spirits. And so in that, she's really reorienting the teacher's pedagogy and the teacher's approach to working with students to be much more humanizing, to index and reflect upon the students as children, but also as people who have sort of social and emotional needs, and not just her job as delivering content, right? That she needs to attend to the whole child. And sort of this overall holistic approach also included being concerned with developing students' sense of self-worth and their belonging, the sense of racial identities. And this was done through what I'm calling sort of conscious acts of racial socialization that played out in terms of teacher-student relationships. So racial socialization is a term that's often used in respect to the home, in which students, particularly African-American children, are socialized into understanding themselves as African-American with sort of cultural history and legacy, but also as members of an oppressed group who have a particular socio-historic narrative in the U.S., but that sort of narrative isn't completely who they are, but they have sort of a larger histories and narratives prior to coming to the U.S. and since the U.S. So it's this both preparation for bias, but also sort of reaffirmation of a racial identity. And a lot of these racial socialization activities occurred between teachers and students, but I really want to highlight that they even bled into student-student interactions and the ways in which teachers modeled certain things that students then took up in their interactions with one another. And one way they did that was through this elder model where they always paired older students with younger students, and that pairing was for things that were simply logistical, like crossing the street when they're on field trips, but also had really fundamentally different mechanisms in classes as well, in terms of one teaching another content, or an older student working with a younger student to organize their plan of work for the day, or to see what they were going to do next in terms of where their work was going. So it had a very cognitive dimension and a very interpersonal dimension. And so in this example, there's a sixth grader working with a fifth grader, and the sixth grader sort of been tutoring this fifth grader in this class. And at one point, the fifth grader just tries to copy, just straight out copy the sixth grader's work. And the sixth grader notices this, and this is what she says. She says, "Do it yourself. How are you going to be smart if you don't do it?" And she kind of has a meta moment. And she says, "Okay, you're smart already, but you can be smarter. Show them you can do it yourself." And so I'm arguing that this sort of really micro level interaction between two students is really also a macro moment, a micro instantiation of a macro narrative that this student is attending to, right? She's indicating them as sort of this larger group of people, these sort of dominant narratives that might say, as a black child, you can't engage in certain kinds of activities, or people won't expect that you can, right? And that because of the sort of this racial socialization mechanism, that you have to sort of demonstrate that you're smart, and this very sort of affirming thing that you're already smart, right? And what you then need to do is to demonstrate to others who might question that through your work, right? So there's this way in which she's engaging in some of the very practices that were modeled between teachers and students with another younger student. And one of the big conceptual findings from this work that speaks to some of the racial socialization mechanisms that I saw happening was what I'm calling politically relevant teaching. And so this holistic philosophy around teaching to the whole child and this sort of approach to racial socialization, I think really highlights that the teachers themselves were attending to multiple levels of context in their pedagogy. And I think it's playing out through, in part, their sort of political clarity of their practice. So similar to culturally relevant teaching, these teachers were trying to work with sort of the cultural practices that students brought to the classroom. They were trying to recognize students' identities and support those identities. But they also had this clarity about issues of racism, issues of oppression that students were experiencing in other environments that weren't just at the level of cultural practices. It was at the level of understanding meta-narratives around African-American students as being potentially ineducable and having dealt with misrepresentations and stereotypes, and that then their pedagogy needed to be informed to sort of deal with the sort of set of conditions that their students were interacting with. And so consistent with other analyses of African-American students by Michelle Foster and others, I found that the pedagogy of the teachers at Marshall, and this is both African-American and non-African-American teachers, really recognized sort of these deep histories of oppression that students had experienced in schools, and sort of these racialized ideologies that students were encountering in schools. And so the Marshall teachers had this sort of political clarity that really pushed them to express the need to care for their students and to protect their students, at the same time to prepare them to succeed academically and to be able to deal with and critique sort of these racialized social conditions and practices they might encounter. And so this one teacher, I think this quote by this one white female teacher really highlights this. She says, "Here we're not scared of black students. They are children, our children," so you can hear Delphin in the back of your head here. "And they're crazy, brilliant, and fun." And I think this is key to highlight. She's a white female teacher who's actually from rural West Virginia, so she didn't really have any innate connection in terms of a shared cultural history or background with these students. But in working with these students, she recognized, and having worked in other environments, she recognized the ways in which black students are positioned as potentially not children, as certainly not the children of the instructor, if the instructor didn't necessarily look like them or didn't see them as their children. And then she also is pushing on sort of identities of blackness here and saying they're crazy, brilliant, and fun. And early in other conversations, she had talked about the ways in which black children often adultify, or in which, in going into other schooled environments, she had seen sort of students enact blackness in only one way, right? They listened to certain kinds of music, they had certain kinds of practice that they would engage with their friends, they dressed in certain kinds of ways, and in this school, everybody did something totally different that you wouldn't expect. So you had these sort of, when we talk about another paper, these sort of constellations of identities that don't always line up given sort of the master narratives that we have around who black kids are, right? That you have a kid who listens to hip hop, you know, and is a skateboarder, and is a math nerd, right? Or you have somebody, in one case we did have this, a kid like this, who was a Rastafarian, who would like punk music, and he wasn't considered weird, right? He had dreadlocks, listened to punk music, but was Rastafarian and vegan, and all sorts of other things that generally we don't see these compilations exist within traditionally school environments. So this is what she's talking about in terms of crazy, brilliant, and fun. And I like to say that sort of different constellations of identities to push back on this idea that sometimes people think that all black spaces or all one-gendered spaces are really essentializing places where you have to be one kind of way to be in that space. And the interviews with parents, with teachers, with students, with alumni, all indicated this was actually the most liberatory space of blackness that they had ever encountered. And they often called it transformative, and sort of the most transformative experience that they had besides college, and sometimes even beyond college. And so this last quote I have from a teacher, I think really highlights this political clarity that I want to get at. And how they're differentiating their experience at Marshall from experiences in other places. Well, I think a lot of kids that come to Marshall are coming from situations where they have felt completely alienated, like culturally alienated or racially alienated, or alienated based on socioeconomic status. Something about that experience has made them feel less than and angry. At Marshall, Gwen, who's the principal and founder, is so careful to make sure that kids feel good about themselves. Not like sort of feel good, but proud of themselves, right? Because they're valuable. Not just like, oh, you're a nice exception, we'll take you, pat, you know, pat your kid on the back. But like you and where you come from and who you are in terms of your family and your ancestry is invaluable. We can't be without you. And then they start to come up that mean little shell that they were protecting themselves with, and then you can see them relax. And they're able to learn which they weren't able to do in places where they felt scared or wrong, or their person was wrong. So it's really highlighting the political clarity that she brings to her practice, and to this political clarity of understanding her African American students sort of in context, right? So in another study I'm going to share with you that I've been doing as a postdoc in the Manhood Development, is with the Manhood Development Program, and I'm going to bring forward this notion of political clarity and politically relevant teaching in this program. But first, let me give you a little context. So, I don't know if anyone has been a part of the conversations in Oakland about sort of the extreme disparities, racialized disparities of African American students, particularly African American male students around disciplinary actions, around chronic absenteeism, and a host of other issues that have actually caused now there to be a voluntary resolution plan from the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education. So while issues of racialized disparities are huge across the United States, particularly for African American males, Oakland has been targeted as one of sort of the worst offenders. So as a result of this, Tony Smith, the former superintendent, created, he had a whole vision for a strategic plan, and one line of that strategic plan was an African American Male Achievement line. And one of the programs of the African American Male Achievement Office that was created was a Manhood Development Program. And the aim of this program was to increase student attendance, so get rid of these issues around chronic absenteeism, increase academic achievement, because there were huge racialized disparities. And the way and the vehicle that was thought to bring that sort of stuff forward was to promote self-awareness and healthy identities of the students. So urban district in Northern California, obviously it's Oakland, high percentage of African American students, and I've gone over some of the indicators. So in this program, they actually created, we followed it from its pilot year to 2 years out. We looked at it in 5 schools. There were 4 high schools and 1 middle school. The program is actually instantiated during the day, so it's considered an elective class. For the high schools and for the middle school, it was after school program. And so we did weekly observations. We did interviews with the teachers and with students. And I didn't mention, but they were mostly African-American 9th grade students, and the reason for that was they wanted to be able to sort of follow students through their high school careers. And obviously the middle school, it was multi-age, so it was 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And we videotaped some of our visits, and so we were able to do qualitative analyses of those as well. And so in this program, we were really concerned with what, or at least I was concerned with, what characterizes the Manhood development classes, and in particular, what characterizes the instructor's pedagogy. And so throughout our analysis, we've come up with a variety of findings. I'm going to talk about one in particular, but I want to mention the other ones quickly. One is in looking at the instructors, we noticed, and their practices in the classrooms, we noticed that they often reframe disciplinary moments and practices. So there were interactions in the classroom between the instructors and the students, and I have to say that the instructors also were African-American males. They were African-American male folks from the community, so some of them had credentials or worked in higher education. Many of them did not, but had extensive background in youth development work. So they were all black, all male spaces. And in these spaces, there often were moments that happened that in other classrooms would probably be seen as moments of defiance, and people would be sent out or sent to the office. And often those moments were reframed then, instead of a disciplinary moment, as sort of a learning moment or a public accountability moment, and people were kept in the classroom. So we have a Harvard Educational Review piece called Dirt on My Record, which talks about these reframings of these practices and the kinds of community that was built in that classroom that created sort of a public space for accountability. We have another article that's under review where we talk about the ways in which the interactions between the teachers and the students and the ways that the teachers frame the context really debunk stereotypes and reimagine identities of black manhood. So we're talking about these identity constellations. We talk about the ways in which the teachers themselves were role models and sort of embodiers, if you will, of certain kinds of identities of black manhood that directly contrasted with stereotypical notions of black manhood, right? So these instructors were fathers, right? We often hear these narratives of black men not being fathers. They were fathers. They cooked. They talked about cooking with their students. At one point, I had one of my children in the class with me, and we talked about this in this paper that we just submitted. And he's holding, and the instructor's holding my child, and all the kids at first are like, you know, baby alert, and they're stepping back, and he reframes the moment to say, oh, you guys have never held a baby before? You guys haven't played with babies? Come up here. Who can make the baby laugh? Who can get the baby to smile? And so then they get engaged in this competition of who can make her laugh. And, you know, so there's a winner, and he gets a little prize. It was something silly like, you know, you get to make an extra beat on the computer after we do our work or something. But it's this real interesting moment where he embodies this role of fatherhood, and then they take up a similar role, right? So he's really debunking the notion that black men aren't fathers. And what I'm going to talk about today is the ways that they enacted a politicized caring, again, pushing on the political clarity that they had, but the ways in which they did that. I'll talk about that in a second. And then what we're working on now is the ways in which the instructors themselves had sort of these organic theories of learning. They had their own theories about how people learn, but also about how then they guide their practice towards supporting students' learning that were both very politicized, but also very racially specific to African American male students. And so it pushes on what we need in terms of credentialing to teach African American students. So in terms of instructors' politicized caring, if you flip onto the other side of the handout that I've given you, there's a little breakout of these different elements. But we noticed in doing interviews with the instructors that they all said very, very similar things about why they came to work with this program and why in particular they were working with African American male students. And I'm not going to go through each bullet fully, but I've talked a little bit about political theory already. Another one was communal bonds, that they really saw that they had, and they really treated their students as extended family. They sort of saw this sort of pervasive lack of care in institutions for African American students, particularly African American male students, who were seen as adults rather than children. So they really extended themselves as family to these children, and they saw themselves as brothers and as fathers, depending upon the age of the instructors. Some were older and some were younger. And in doing that, they sort of initiated these relationships of co-membership in a racial and gender community. They also, in seeing their students as children, as fundamentally children who aren't often seen as children, they engaged with them in potential affirming ways. So as opposed to thinking about, the ways in which they might present themselves in ways that are defiant, or that they might index sort of these macro narratives of ineducability, they really saw them in an asset-based approach, what they're bringing to the classroom, what ways in which they're presenting themselves and their knowledge can I build upon. So building off of Yozo's notion, I really talk about the cultural wealth, the aspirational capital, the social capital, and cultural capital that these students were seen to bring to the class that were not recognized in other spaces. And finally is developmentally appropriate. It's fundamentally seeing these students as children and as humans sort of engaged in sort of racialized social conditions. They then therefore attended to them in ways that were appropriate for adolescence. They attended to the ways in which acts of defiance were really emotional outbursts. And how would one then respond to that and support that sort of release of energy in productive ways, as opposed to send them to the principal where they're just going to, either get sent home for the day or just lose instructional time, right? Which obviously doesn't support racialized disparities, and it doesn't support, issues of chronic absenteeism in classes. So they were thinking about ways to reframe that in ways that were very developmentally appropriate, and realize who these students were and their vulnerabilities in being African American male students in this context. And this paper is currently under review, and Sakir, who just stepped out for a second, actually does a beautiful microanalysis of an interaction between a teacher and a student. And I'm not going to really unpack this interaction other than to say that this represents the kind of micro-level analysis that we're doing with some of this work that we had video on, where we see the ways in which, so everybody's giving me the handout, so they really want to hear a little bit more, so let me give you a slice, which is, in this interaction, there's two students. The teacher's attending to one student, Chris, who's thrown something. And in that moment, when he's not attending to the whole class, two students almost have an altercation. And in that moment, we're recognizing that Chris is so we're thinking about the semic ecology of a classroom, the ways in which meaning is being made through how people are interacting. That Chris is sort of embodying the tension of the classroom when the two students are about to engage in a physical altercation. That really sort of signals to the teacher who's talking to Chris that something's happening behind him. And then what the teacher does is he both uses his words, so what's not going to happen, what I need you to do, and he also uses his body in grabbing a student's arm and pulling him away from the scene. So you have one student, the two students sort of facing each other, one student who's listening in, like leaning in like he's going to do something, and the teacher really putting himself in the middle of it, physically putting himself in the middle and pushing them aside, in which case he grabs one student by the arm and sort of grabs him sort of a half hug and pulls him away, and then the other student sort of relaxes and slacks back and moves back too. So you see in this interaction the ways in which he disrupted an interaction, sort of a breach that happened, and the ways in which the students responded to this breach in positive ways that only could have happened because of the kind of relationship that he had. So the students whose arm he grabbed, you could see him doing something else, like pushing it back or fighting him, but instead he really kind of welcomes the interaction and leans into it like, I didn't want to do that anyway, I'm glad you're here. And the other student also attending to that and being like, okay, I'm going to fall back and step away. So they're both attending to that. And we also see this embodied within Chris, the sort of third-party student who, from his tense position also then sits back and relaxes. So in that moment, we see the ways in which this politicized caring is enacted through action and interaction with students in ways that reflect the political clarity, because it then goes on to talk with the students about how certain things are not going to happen because they're African American males and all they have is each other, and the kinds of violence that is happening in Oakland. But also in a very developmentally appropriate way, because he's realizing that it's children who are engaging in a very socially salient moment that isn't a moment of disrespect or aggression towards him or of defiance, but really is just a tension that when an adult ally can come in and recognize it for what it is, it can often be diffused, right? So this is a great example of, I think, how teachers talked about the politicized caring. So I just shared with you how we analyze it at the micro level, but then talking about how the teachers themselves are looking at sort of the multiple levels of context in their own clarity, in their own political clarity, and how that informs their political clarity, and how they think about it in terms of their instruction. This is one of the manhood development instructors. And in the interview, we had asked him, why did he decide to teach with this program? And so he says, in school specifically, there's no relevant curriculum. And our boys, whether you want to believe it or not, are ostracized, marginalized. You know, they're seen as criminals. I wonder what's the percentage of teachers that come in looking at our black boys and say, wow, goodness. And our boys feel it too. You ain't got to say it. They see how people look at them. You've already prejudged who I am. That's not knowing someone. I think I'm working on changing that culture because that's what they do to us. And then we internalize it. We keep thinking we're a problem. Then we don't want to come to class. Then we don't want to show up. We don't want to participate, and they flunk you. Then they just fail you. And then they say, well, you wasn't participating. And because of him and his ability and him not, it's always a child. But you don't realize how you facilitated the child to check out. Clearly, political clarity here. In terms of understanding who the student is in context and understanding how the student has had experiences in which their personhood and their activities have been seen in a very racialized way, but also in the ways in which he's expressing his communal bonds with the students by saying we, right? He's saying, you know, these kind of students are also who I am, or who I was as a child, and I've experienced these sorts of things. So he's seeing sort of allyship and community with these students. We're also seeing a very potentially affirming thing in talking about the ways in which institutions are setting up things, or particular teachers are setting up things that support student disengagement, rather than, you know, using a cultural deficit model that the students are coming with a lack of motivation or a lack of desire to participate. Because one thing that's really interesting that doesn't have anything to directly do with this particular quote is that the students that were in the Manhood Development Program, while many of them were doing poorly in school, a lot of them had high attendance. So they were there. And so it made you think, like, well, why are they coming if they don't want to learn? Which sort of upends this notion that they maybe don't want to learn, but that maybe something else is going on that we should be attending to. And finally, it's his conversation, his statement here is also very developmentally situated, in that he's thinking about it as a child. And what we're doing is we're not having sort of an asset model to think about a child and their motivations, but in reframing this student, no matter if they're 6'5" and 100 pounds heavier than you, as a child and only able to manage a certain set of social conditions and understandings given their developmental age, that should really inform how you think about how you interact with that child, even though they might present themselves in ways that seem much more adultified. So, to give you a sense of how I think about what I've learned from all of this and the implications of this kind of work, so this would be the very end of the mixtape. Should be that last song where it sort of ties it all together. Obviously, socio-affective factors, ways that I've talked about teacher-student relationships, talked about racial socialization in schools. It's something I haven't talked as much about, but about teachers' conceptions of what their job is. A lot of the instructors talked about it was their job to support students' positive identities, to support students in seeing themselves as role models for other people and as more than a stereotype, and developing these students' life skills beyond just their learning of the content in this class. That these socio-affective factors really provide the preconditions for learning. they really frame how a learning environment is constructed and how a child sees themselves within that learning environment and the ways in which they can engage then in the actual content of the course. That there are also discourses of education, of teachers' political theory and pedagogy that shape these environments. So seeing these instructors as having a very informed pedagogy and really having sort of informed theories about how learning occurs and how students experience schools, that informs their own pedagogy, but also a larger critique of education that they have about how students experience education and the ways in which educational environments are not responding to the needs of students. And some implications for this work are obviously at the level of teacher training, what counts as content knowledge? What kind of content are we talking about? Are we talking about math content, science content? Are we talking about, broader life content and sort of content of sort of social conditions or racialized experiences? Talking about issues of socialization, that schools are fundamentally socializing spaces that are populated by humans who engage in social activity, and realizing that and accepting that socialization not as a thing that we try to guard against, but as a thing that we take up and utilize to support positive student identities as learners, as members of particular groups, and as participators in particular types of disciplines, like mathematics. And the political work of teaching, which Rochelle Gutierrez talks more about, which is thinking about engaging with certain sets of students, not just because, I want all kids to learn, but to understand the ways in which certain students have experienced school differently in other places, and how that informs the kinds of work that you're doing in the classroom. So your job is not just to deliver content, but to really be sort of a social worker, a cultural worker, and also a political worker who's sort of working towards the advancement of these students, and through that, the advancement of the groups of people, in this case, the racial groups that these students often represent. And I always have to say that this is not prescriptive. So this doesn't mean that you just go jump in the middle of a fight between kids that you see, or that you engage in certain kinds of practices that we might see in these classrooms. But that it's revelatory for the ways in which pedagogy can happen, the ways in which the kinds of clarity one can bring into their practice, and also the ways in which we can attend to see this multiple levels. We can attend to the ways in which things that we're doing in sort of moment by moment interaction with students can very much be reflective of the ways in which we understand larger narratives of race and position ourselves with respect to those narratives. And then the quick hint for my current research is so based upon these experiences that we've had working with Open Unified, I've actually been able to, at the level of the district, understand some of the kinds of things that people are working with in terms of like the strategic plan, like I talked about the African American Middle Achievement Office. There's this larger vision to incorporate ideas around racial socialization and changing conditions of school climate, racialized school climates in the district. So there's a sort of opportunity where a lot of these issues are at the forefront of the minds of the district. And so they're not quite putting money forth yet, but they're certainly putting effort forth in identifying leadership who are doing good work in schools with African American students, male and female. And so there's this opportunity to see spaces, racially heterogeneous spaces, not just all black schools or all black classrooms, but racially heterogeneous spaces where the leadership themselves is also buying into some of these social affective factors in the way they affect learning, in ways that can then influence the kinds of policies they have in their schools, and hopefully the kinds of instructional practices that we're seeing play out in classrooms. So I'm particularly interested in how the district and particular schools that I'm looking at really are addressing these socio-affective factors. I want to focus on mathematics classrooms because what we're seeing is that sometimes this awareness around socio-affective conditions happen at the level of the district. It may happen at the level of the leadership of a school, but we're not always seeing it play out in terms of the level of instruction in classrooms. So it's really having to have that micro level analysis in classrooms to see the ways in which these sort of discourses of reform of the district might be playing out in classrooms, and where there's actually homegrown approaches that people are already engaging in that also are tending to be socio-affective. And so the way I always look at it, like I mentioned in the beginning, was at the level of content, what people are doing, the level of pedagogy, and also the level of interaction. And so I've been interviewing district officials and principals at schools to identify which schools I wanted to go into. And right now I'm beginning to do a lot of classroom observations as a segue into some interviews with different stakeholders. And so I'm at 3 schools, looking at math classrooms at each of those schools. They're all middle schools that I'm looking at. And they all are environments in which the leadership is very open and receptive to these ideas. In some cases, it's because of the kinds of strategic plans that Oakland has implemented. In some cases, it's things that they've already been doing for a long time that align with sort of the vision of the strategic plan, and even maybe push the strategic plan further than it is currently. And so this is the work that I'm engaged in now. I would love to have some findings to share with you. But if you've ever negotiated access to sites, you know that it happens when it happens. So we're just starting to get into a lot of those classrooms and see interesting things happen. So, thank you.
Thanks so much for your talk.
Yeah.
I was curious when you were talking about the men who were the teachers for the male development classes, manhood development classes, and you said that some of them are community members and some are teachers or have credential or professors, and I was just curious more about like their relationship to the school when they were there, like if they were, how either like they positioned themselves or the school positioned them, if they were like going to basketball games or like or like how much they became a part of the school community.
So of the 5 teachers that we focus on, some of them, one of them was already part of the school. He was a counselor, and so obviously had very deep relationships with the school and attended all the basketball games that he was doing already. So he was already a member of the school community. The other ones were not, and some of them had good relationships with the school where they were included within the school and were able to participate in a lot of things and were invited to do so. But the vast majority very much saw themselves as separate from the school and felt that that's how they were positioned as separate from the school. And in one case, it was a very antagonistic relationship where the principal really felt there was initiative burnout, that Oakland really had to do all these initiatives, and he wasn't going to do, he could only do some of them very, very well. And the male achievement one wasn't one that he was able to take on. And so he kind of saw the manhood development class in his school as somewhat of an Occupy movement, like people just came into my school and are telling me things that I need to do, whether or not I agree with them. And so that relationship was a bit more antagonistic, and so that person wasn't invited to participate in a lot of things. But that's at the level of the institution. And obviously there were differentiations about individual teachers' engagement with them. Some of them really were able to help students navigate the school by going to speak with other teachers, and teachers saw them as a resource, which was some of the initial intent. Whereas the other teachers saw that class as a place where all the African American students went and talked trash about them. And so then they weren't able to engage in a very productive discourse with the instructor. But at the level of the students, they all saw it as a safe haven. And it was interesting because in interviewing them at the beginning, they were all very confused why they were in the class, even though they kind of opted into it. You know, and their own thoughts about why they're in that class are really, really illustrative, because some of them were like, oh, I just knew it was a class for all the bad kids. Or it was a class for kids who were going to probably fail. Whereas other kids thought, oh, it's a class where all the cool people go. So their own ideas about why it was an all-African-American class were very interesting. But they all saw it as a safe haven where they could sort of talk about experiences they had in other parts of the school, and where they could have an advocate and ally with the instructor. So there were cases in which it was sort of the class was seen as an institutional support, and then the teacher navigated it as such. And there were cases in which it was just sort of a support for the student, and there were different levels of relationships with the instructor and school. I can't do more than all the talking. No.
Hi. This is a great talk. Thank you so much. So my question is very specific to the teacher training aspect of supporting teachers to be supports for their students. So how do we move teachers beyond I'm just here to teach math to I'm here to teach this little child in this embedded in this social political context, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Which is the $1 million question, right? If I had the best answer to that, I'd be revolutionary in education right now. But no, it's a question that we grapple with in part because part of our work with the district is a partnership. So we actually try to give back information to them in ways that support instruction. And one of the sort of difficulties has been, and this gets to your question a little bit too, is that initially because the teachers weren't credentialed, a lot of people wanted them to be credentialed, and there was a lot of pushback from families to now where most of the teachers actually are in fact credentialed. But what the vision for this course was is that the instructors of these courses would then do teacher training with other teachers and engage in sort of collaborative inquiry cycles where the teachers from other classes would come into the manhood development class and see the kinds of things were happening, both as a way to sort of explicitly attend to what was happening, but also to show in practice how things were happening. And so we're just starting to sort of get into the messiness of how to communicate that stuff back to the district. But I think one way to do it is to, I mean, and I'm even seeing this in my adolescent development class that I'm teaching now, is to really have people have a developmental lens to the fact that these are children, as opposed to what can be a very instinctual lens to something that you see as other or foreign or even bigger than you. If you're talking about, the vast majority of teachers are white females, not from urban contexts, which is what's very foreign. And instead of seeing that foreign other thing, which I don't like that term, but I can't think of anything better right now, as scary and different, seeing, this is still a child, and I'm the adult, and how can I then support their understanding of this moment? And in adolescent development class, and I think we're seeing this in the work we're doing with these instructors as well, part of that happens from having teachers identify the multiple worlds that students navigate and the messages about who they are in those worlds that might actually be different across spaces. So for example, if we think about sort of a politicized caring approach, if we think about teaching teachers how to do that, we could think about, okay, you're asking your student to do a problem today and to work on a worksheet and they're not engaged. Have you asked them why? Do you have a 5-minute check-in at the beginning of class to see how everybody's doing, is anything going on, that either can serve as a bridge for understanding where they're at today, or for adapting and utilizing your curriculum in more effective ways. And the school that I did my dissertation research at did that. They had a compliment and complaint circle at the beginning of every day, which was like 15 to 20 minute check-in where everybody could have a compliment or a complaint about anything with respect to the school or outside of the school. And a lot of times it had to do with respect to the school or people in the school, because they're elementary students. So they would say things like, a certain person, stole my peanut butter crackers, and they're always stealing my stuff, and I don't like them, and they would talk about it. And then that would diffuse because they had that conversation, and everybody would say, do we know who that person is? And they'd say, yes. How does that person want to speak up and respond to that, and they would or wouldn't. That really set the sort of emotional tone for the day about how people engage with that student. But then also, it became a point that people could push on to the content. Even in very basic ways, like, we've got 4 peanut butter crackers and 2 people, like, in a way that sort of really bridges sort of emotional aspects of learning with the cognitive aspects that we want to get kids to. But I think those are a lot of strategies that people have used to great success. Because I think one point I may not have made as explicitly is that I think that a lot of these socio-affective factors are salient for all students. We all perform well for the teachers that we love. It's also harder for us to perform for the teachers that, we don't think very highly of us. But it's particularly salient for students who are already socially vulnerable and see their own identities and personhood as potentially at stake or at odds with a given context.
How involved are the parents? Because I think
Which parents?
The parents of these kids, because it's not just the teachers, but it's
Oh,
also the
definitely.
parents too. Because I think a lot of these kids are not learning self-regulation at home, and so they're coming to the classroom with a lot of baggage. That makes, how involved are the parents getting into the open school district? Because that's just another part of the equation, I think.
Right, and I'm not going to talk about the parents in Oakland as a sort of homogenous group, but to speak to sort of specific segments of parents that I've interacted with. The parents at the elementary school that I interacted with, and again, even though and I don't know how much people were able to read in the short time I had it up there. It was an independent school, so it did have a tuition every month. And a lot of the families either paid that tuition or did wrote grants to get support to pay for that tuition, or did like work programs or work exchanges to pay for the tuition at the school. A lot of those parents weren't, highly educated, highly affluent parents. They were working class families that chose the school for a variety of reasons and often couldn't engage in the school in very standard ways that we think about parental involvement. So, they didn't have a PTA, but they got their kids to school on time. They, asked their kids if they had homework. They often gave rides to other kids to get to school. So they engaged in what I would call sort of parent engagement in a very much more broad sense that demonstrated their willingness to have their kids achieve in school and their own motivation and value of education. And I think there's a lot of blaming of parents' lack of value of education. And then in that environment, but also with the Manhood Development Program, a lot of times that they've had parent-teacher meetings where they talk about the ways in which the parents can support the students. And these ways are also very holistic. Some of them are, no TV during the week or limited TV during the week. Other things are give your kids bigger lunches. The kids are hungry. One example is from the Manhood Development Program is the instructor has a meeting with parents and he says, I'm feeding grown men here and you keep on sending me third grade snacks. And he's talking about how the ways in which, because they had free snacks from the district, so the kids would just tear through the snacks. And the parents were receptive to that. And so I'm highlighting that kind of an interaction in that I think it needs to be less about blaming the parents and more about bringing the parents to where you want them to be for them to be able to support the kinds of things that you're doing in your classroom. Because we do have a very strong narrative of parents don't care about education, there are things going on at home. And in Oakland, there are things going on at home, but the home is not just the parents in a particular household, it's also a neighborhood, right? If somebody got shot on the corner down the street from their house, that kid is dealing with complex trauma that the parent may or may not know how to deal with. And then how do we talk about that in schools and think about it with respect to the kinds of learning environments that we're creating? So I want to broaden the notion of the home, but also think about the ways in which we're doing things at the level of the school that bring parents into the conversation. I always, Tia's going to probably kick me, but I always talk about the power of home visits. A lot of these instructors, both from the elementary school that I looked at to the instructors in the Manhood Development Program who weren't even, official teachers at the school but taught this one course, took kids home and met their parents and talked with parents. And those parents often only heard from the school when it's a problem and it's something punitive. So building that relationship with the parents then felt that they could reach out to the teachers for additional support.
I won't be mad. I was going to add on to what you were saying about home visits. Maxine comes and does a beautiful lecture for us in DT about home visits and the importance of them. I think you started that 2 years ago, maybe?
Yeah.
But one of our student teachers that year is now in her classroom because of that. She is now doing home visits with all of her families and started early school year. And I think it's a beautiful thing. It's a great way to connect and to get to, like you said, it establishes that relationship from the beginning. And then the first communication is not something negative, it's something positive.
Thank you.
It is 5:30. If people have other questions, you're free to stay, but now's your chance to leave if you have to leave.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.